It is good to be here. Good to see everyone. We are studying in the book of 2 Samuel, continuing that study, of course. And as I mentioned last week, we're getting to the good stuff. Some of it is the bad stuff, but I mean good in the sense of it. There's a lot going on. It's very easy to read. It's fast reading because there's just so much action and so much going on. But you getting of course into the problems in David's family, that many of them being consequences of his sin with Bathsheba. I mentioned something last week about sometimes people accuse the Bible of having a contradiction or a discrepancy because the penalty for adultery under the old law that was a capital crime. The penalty was death. They would be stoned. There are two considerations that we pointed out. It may be that the people should have done that and just didn't carry it out, or it may be that they were lacking the 2 or 3 witnesses required for a death sentence. It could be either one of those. Either way, there's not a discrepancy. There's not a problem there, because it's not that God just said, "Oh, no big deal, David, you're not going to die." Either way, it's not that God is just overlooking it and making some kind of special exception for David. So somebody pointed out after class last week that with all that happened, it's very interesting to think about. With all that happened to David, he may have found himself wishing that he had just received that death penalty, because so much happened in his family. And on at least one occasion, David does say, after the death of Absalom, I wish it had been me. I wish I had died. And sometimes you live to see such times that you think, I'd been better off not to have lived to seen this. So anyway, that was something that was pointed out, and I thought that was pretty interesting because, David, he didn't receive the death penalty, obviously, but wow, did he have a lot of heartache and a lot of hurt in his life as a result, as a consequence of this sin with Bathsheba. So when we get into chapter 13, here begin the consequences of David's sin. So after this, Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Now, this would be his half-sister. Obviously, still inappropriate, but she was full sister to Absalom, half-sister to Amnon. Amnon was so vexed that he fell sick for his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and Amnon thought it hard for him to do anything to her. He knew better than this. He knew this isn't right, but he's just so infatuated. He's not in love. He is infatuated, and he just feels like I've got to have her. He's one fella called it lust sick, and that certainly seems to be the case. He's lost all sense of reason, and he's lost his moral compass. Does this ever happen today? I mean, you better believe it, right? We see it sometimes with young folks. We see it sometimes with older folks. Become so lust sick that even wise men, I've seen it happen to preachers, to elders, long-time family men. It can happen, and just lose all sense of reason and logic. And that's what happens to Amnon here. And in a situation like that, would it not be great to have a friend who would say, "Hey, this isn't right, man. You know better than that. That's not right. You can't do this." But Amnon had a friend, verse 3, whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother. This would be his cousin. And Jonadab was a very subtle man. Amnon had a friend, but not a good friend. And he said to him, "Why art thou, being the king's son, lean from day to day? Why are you so down in the mouth, we might say? Wilt thou not tell me?" Amnon said unto him, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." And so Jonadab, instead of being a good friend and telling him, "Hey, I'm sorry, this isn't right. You can't do this. Jonadab says, well, here's what you need to do. I'll help you figure this thing out. So he says, lay thee down on thy bed, make thyself sick. When thy father cometh to see thee, saying to him, I pray thee, let my sister Tamar come and give me meat, and dress the meat in my sight, that I may see it and eat it at her hand. So Amnon takes the advice. He lay down, made himself sick. When the king was come to see him, that's exactly what he says. Let my sister Tamar come, make me a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat at her hand. So David sent home to Tamar, saying, go now to thy brother Amnon's house and dress him meat. David has no idea what's going on. No reason to suspect anything, right? At this point. And so he goes and he says, Tamar, go to your brother's house, and he's sick. You know, he wants some food. Can you go help him out? And of course, Tamar, she does exactly what her dad asked. She went to her brother Amnon's house. He was laid down. She took flour, kneaded it, made cakes in his sight, and did bake the cakes. She took a pan and poured them out before him, but he refused to eat. And so then Amnon says, have out all men for me. Everybody get out of here. And so Amnon says to Tamar, bring the meat into the chamber, that I may eat of thine hand. Tamar took the cakes which she had made, brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. When she had brought them unto him to eat, he took hold of her and said, come, lie with me, my sister. Well, now she knows what's up. She knows what's going on. And she, of course, says, nay, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not thou this folly. This is foolishness. What is wrong with you? And lay with her. Well, in English, we would say he raped her. So he forced her. And notice verse 15. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And Amnon said unto her, arise, be gone. Well, there's no surprise there. God designed sex to be in marriage. He designed that relationship to take place within the confines of marriage. Obviously, in a situation where one person is forcing another, in a situation where it's outside of the bonds of marriage, it's not going to be truly satisfying. It's not going to be fulfilling. And in this case, it actually flip-flops his feelings, which, of course, he was never in love with her to begin with. It was an infatuation. And imagine that. He forces this woman, and it wasn't all that he imagined it would be. Just so perverted is Amnon's mind. And so now he says, get away from me. You disgust me, is essentially what he's saying to her. And she says, now she's even more upset perhaps, because she says, no, there's no cause. This evil sending me away is greater than the other. But he wouldn't listen. He called his servant that ministered unto him and said, put now this woman out from me and bolt the door after her. Kick her out. Well, of course, he's one of the king's sons. He's got servants, and they do what they're told. She had a garment of diverse colors upon her, for with such robes were the king's daughters that were virgins apparelled. Then his servant brought her out and bolted the door after her. She put ashes on her head, verse 19, rent her garment of diverse colors that was on her, and laid her hand on her head and went on crying. Absalom, verse 20. This, don't mistake me. Amnon's crime, Amnon's sin was in his lust and in his rape of his half-sister. But he also made a very critical mistake in that he crossed Absalom. Absalom was not a man to be trifled with, as we're going to see. Absalom, her brother, said unto her, has Amnon thy brother been with thee? But hold now thy peace, my sister. He saw this, and sometimes the Bible will say just a little small phrase or a few words, and there's a lot more in that. Probably what would have happened here is she put ashes on her head, and that was a sign of mourning. She's torn this diverse colored robe, and Absalom sees her and says, well, what's going on? And she may have even tried the typical what some people do when something's wrong. Oh, no, nothing's wrong. I don't know if she would have tried that, because she's obviously mourning. She's got the ash on her head. Tell me what's going on. And maybe he puts two and two together. Maybe he pries it out of her. I don't know. But he figures out, Amnon has raped you. And he says to her, and it's kind of, you get a little insight into Absalom. You can imagine this poor lady's distress and her emotional state. And he just says, hey, keep it quiet. Don't say a word. Uh, he's your brother. Don't regard this thing. How would you like to hear that if you've just been raped, and raped by your half-brother, no less? So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. But when King David heard of all these things, he was very wroth. David is angry, but what does David do? He doesn't do anything. I don't know why, but he's not doing anything at this time. But anyway, Absalom spake unto his brother Amnon, neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar. We might say Absalom is kind of playing it close to the vest. He's not really going in, yelling and screaming and trying to pick a fight, but he's certainly not being friendly with Amnon either. He's got his plan in mind. He knows how this thing's going to play out because he's working it. 2 full years. 2 full years pass. Again, why does David not do something here? I don't know. It may be that David is distraught. Maybe it's an awkward situation that here's your son who has forced your daughter, and another son is upset about it, and I don't know. I mean, I guess we just can't really give an answer for that, but it just blows my mind that 2 full years pass, and David's done nothing. At least that's every indication here. So Absalom has sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is beside Ephraim. He invited all the king's sons, and Absalom came to the king, and he says, I've got these sheep shearers. Let the king and his servants go with thy servant. Come with me, Absalom. The king says, no, we're not going to all go lest we be chargeable unto thee. We'll be, you'll have to feed us and all that. And he says, Absalom pressed him. He keeps, begging him, come on, you need to come. Howbeit he would not go, but blessed him. He tries to get David to go as well. And I don't know if he wanted David to witness this or if he's already conspiring against David somewhat. I don't know. But it's interesting. He wanted David to come, and David wouldn't, but David does bless him, and Absalom says, well, if not, I pray thee let my brother Amnon go with us. And maybe that was the design all along, is he knew David wouldn't go, and so he figures, if David feeling guilty, hey, well, look, since you can't go, let Amnon go. Again, you got to figure, if you're David, how do you not suspect something here? But be that as it may, the king says, why should he go with thee? Absalom pressed him, and he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. So Amnon, Absalom, all the king's sons go. Absalom had commanded his servants. You mark or notice when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, when he's getting a little liquored up. And when I say to you, smite Amnon, then kill him. Fear not, have not I commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. So sure enough, that's exactly what they do. And when it happens, they do. In verse 29, as Absalom commanded, all the king's sons arose. Every man gat him upon his mule and fled. They are scattering from Absalom. I don't know if he worked up some kind of, sometimes that'll happen where somebody kind of works you up into a frenzy and you're that mob mentality almost. And then sometimes after something big happens out of that mentality, then it's like all of a sudden, it's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever had this happen. I remember one time when I was a just young person, maybe early teens, my sister and I, we got into it. And I mean, we are fussing and fighting, and I went, and she had shut her door, and I managed to get, I think I had a big stick or something, and I had managed to get in the door before she could shut it. And so I used that thing, and I'm going to pry the door open. But when I did, it just ripped that door. The hinges just came, and oh man, as soon as that happened, there's no more anger. There's just, I'm dead. Daddy's going to find this, and I'm dead. And so even my sister was like, oh, what did you do? And it's just this instantly, now we're on the same side. We got to fix this because, Daddy sees this, that's it. So, that type of mentality, you're frenzied, you're angry, and then when it happens, now they've killed Amnon, and it's kind of like, seems that it's kind of like, uh-oh, we went through with this. And everybody flees. So, yes, sir. I know, right? He had his servants do it. Yeah, he has his servants do this, and yeah, it might be kind of he's thinking he's got plausible deniability. Hey, well, look, the servants did it. But of course, he's commanded them. And the king's sons, no doubt, the actual sons of the king are thinking, we're next. So they get, which again, maybe Absalom's already got some kind of conspiracy in mind. But anyway, the king's sons flee, and while they're in the way, they're still on the road, we would say, and tidings came to David, Absalom has slain all the king's sons. I don't know how it got distorted to that, but if you've ever played that little game, when you were children, where you pass information along, I don't know what do they call that now? Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. We called it gossip. I mean, that's what it was. It's just an example of how gossip works. Grapevine, yeah, they've got a more PC name for it now, grapevine, but it's gossip. But that was the idea. You'd pass something along, and by the time you got just a few people down the line, it is so distorted. But that's what happens here. Is the gossip starts to get back to the king, the grapevine, if you want to call it that, and all of a sudden it's all of the king's sons are slain. There's not one of them left. And so David rises up, he tears his garments, he lay on the earth. All his servants stood by with their clothes rent. I mean, he just, no doubt, in a state of shock. Jonadab comes along, old Jonadab, and he's a slick one, isn't he? So he comes along, and he's going to bring good news. He likes to kind of operate behind the scenes unless it's going to mean something for him. And so he says, let not my lord suppose that they have slain all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon only is dead. For by the appointment of Absalom this hath been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Where did he get the idea for that plan, Mr. Jonadab? And it's interesting how he left himself out of that. Well, hey, look, Absalom did this, and he's been after Amnon from the day that he forced his half-sister Tamar. He leaves out the fact that he encouraged Amnon to do that. But he says, now therefore let not my lord the king take the thing to his heart to think that all the king's sons are dead, for Amnon only is dead. So Absalom flees, of course. The young man that keeps the watch lifts up his eyes, looked, and behold, there came much people by the way of the hillside behind him. Jonadab tells the king, behold, the king's sons come, as thy servant said, so it is. And so when he's made an end of speaking, the king's sons came, they lifted up their voice and wept. The king also and all his servants wept very sore. So Absalom flees. He goes to Geshur, to Talmai. And David mourned for his son every day. He loved Absalom. And you see that throughout this account. In fact, a love for Absalom that often blinded his eyes to judgment and to reason and prudence. So Absalom flees. He goes to Geshur. He's there 3 years. That's important, by the way. Remember that in just a moment. The soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. Now, Joab perceived that the king's heart was toward Absalom. And so Joab sends this woman to Tekoa, or he sends to Tekoa to get this wise woman, and he says, you're going to pretend to be a mourner, put on mourning apparel, you're not going to anoint yourself with oil, like somebody who's mourning a long time for the dead. And so he tells her what to say, and so she goes to the king, and the king wants to know what's wrong, there in verse 5. And so she says, I'm a widow, my husband is dead, I had 2 sons, they strove together, verse 6, there was nobody to break them up. And they got into it so bad, one of them killed the other one. And she said, listen, the whole family is risen against me, and they say, you deliver the son that killed his brother, because we're going to kill him to avenge, the brother that he killed. And we'll destroy there also. So, she says, they shall quench my coal which is left. My name's going to be put out in Israel, in other words. Shall not leave to my husband neither name nor remainder upon the earth. And so, the king tells her, King David, he says, go to your house, I'll give you charge. And she says, the iniquity be on me, my father's house, let the king and his throne be guiltless. And so David says, nobody's going to touch your son. And so she says, I pray thee, verse 11, let the king remember the Lord thy God, that thou wouldest not suffer the revengers of blood to destroy any more, lest they destroy my son. And David says, as the Lord liveth, there shall not one hair of thy son fall to the earth. And so she says, King, can I say one more thing to you? And David says, say on. She says, why have you thought such a thing against the people of God? For the king doth speak this thing as one which is faulty, in that the king doth not fetch home again his banished. She says, you're kind of a hypocrite, David. I don't know what Joab said to this woman, what he promised her, but that's pretty gutsy to stand right there face to face, as it were, with the king and say, I appreciate what you're doing here, king, but you're kind of a hypocrite. And so she goes on and says, we must needs die, and there is water spilt on the ground which cannot be gathered up again. Hey, everybody dies. You're all worried about Amnon. Neither doth God respect any person, yet doth he devise means that his banished be not expelled from him. Now therefore that I'm come to speak of this thing unto my lord the king is because the people have made me afraid. And thy handmaid said, I will now speak unto the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his handmaid. She says, for the king will hear to deliver his handmaid out of the hand of the man that will destroy me and my son together out of the inheritance of God. And so she says, the word of my lord the king shall now be comfortable, for as an angel of God, so is my lord the king to discern good and bad. Therefore the Lord thy God will be with thee. The king answers and says, you tell me the truth. Joab put you up to this, didn't he? And David sees right through it. He says, you tell me the truth. She says, okay. Didn't Joab put you up to this? She said, yes. In fact, she says, as thy soul liveth, there in verse 19, my lord the king, none can turn to the right hand or to the left from aught that my lord the king hath spoken. For thy servant Joab, he bade me, and he put all these words in the mouth of thine handmaid. By the way, it's interesting. She says, nobody can turn to the right hand or to the left from aught that my lord the king hath spoken, except his family. David has a real problem with his family. She's basically saying there, David, there's nothing that goes on in this kingdom you don't know about. I mean, he saw right through this. Joab put you up to this, didn't he? She's saying, wow, nothing gets by you. Unless it's one of his sons, right? David had a problem in that aspect of his life. He kind of turned a blind eye sometimes to his own children. So she says, yes, it was Joab. He put me up to this. So she admits to it, and the king says to Joab. So now I guess he called in Joab. We're not really told. He's speaking to Joab at this point. She may have left, and he's called in Joab, but she may still be there. But anyway, he's speaking to Joab. Joab bows himself. He shows respect for the king. And Joab says, look, I know I found grace in your sight, O king, and that you've fulfilled the request of your servant. So Joab went to the king and said to Joab there in verse 21, I skipped over that word. He says, I've done this thing. Go bring Absalom again. So he does. He goes and he brings him, brought him to Jerusalem. But here's what David says. There's a condition, verse 24. Let him turn to his own house and let him not see my face. So Absalom returned to his own house, and saw not the king's face. Now it's interesting. Amnon rapes his half-sister, and David, at least there's no indication he really lifted a finger to do much about it. Absalom gets vengeance, and I'm not saying that was okay. That was not his place to execute that vengeance, and he didn't really even do it himself, as was pointed out. He went the cowardly way and had his servants do it. But David is really upset about that, and I read this and I wonder if David's one of those things where he's really upset at himself because he knows a lot of this is on him, and that he did a lot of this by not taking action in the matter with Amnon. But anyway, he's clearly pretty upset with Absalom. And he says, look, he's going to maintain some control here. He says, I'm going to let him come home, but he's not going to see me. He can just stay there at his own house. But in all Israel there was none to be so much praised as Absalom for his beauty. From the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. Just a nice-looking man. He's going to be a perfect politician. Nice-looking, We'll see in chapter 15 he kisses the babies, all that stuff. When he polled his head, for it was at every year's end that he polled it, cut his hair, in other words, because the hair was heavy on him. Therefore he polled it, and he weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels after the king's weight. So unto Absalom 3 sons, there were born 3 sons, 1 daughter. He named his daughter Tamar, after his sister, of course. She was a woman of a fair countenance. So Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem and saw not the king's face. Therefore Absalom sent for Joab to have him sent to the king. Now Absalom he's kind of thinking, all right, enough. It's time for me to be able to see the king. So he sends to Joab. Joab just ignores him. And so he sends again the second time. Joab doesn't come. He's ignoring him. So you know what Joab decides? Or Absalom? I'll get his attention. His field is near mine. He's got barley there. So he tells his servants, hey, go set Joab's field on fire. Well, guess who comes running? Joab. Joab came to Absalom to his house, said, what's up? What are you doing? And Absalom says, you could just, you get the picture here that Absalom's just very calm. Well, I sent to you. I was saying, come here, that I may send to the king. And he essentially says, you didn't come, so I'm just getting your attention. But he says, here's the message for the king there in the middle part of verse 32. Wherefore am I come from Geshur? It had been good for me to have been there still. Now therefore let me see the king's face. And if there be any iniquity in me, let him kill me. Isn't that interesting? Absalom says, if there's something wrong, let him kill me. Well, is that what Absalom did, or did he have his hirelings do it? So Joab came to the king and told him. And when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. Now they've reconciled, and all seems to be going well, right? But Absalom prepared chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. Well, Absalom is, by the way, the matter with the woman from Tekoa, I meant to mention this before I move on into this conspiracy. It seems that, obviously Joab put her up to this. We know that. The question is why? Because Joab is going to meet Absalom in battle. Spoiler alert, I guess we should say, but hopefully you all know the outcome of this anyways. You've studied it before. Joab is going to meet Absalom in battle, if you want to call it that. Absalom is pretty defenseless, but Joab's going to meet him, and he doesn't blink. I mean, he kills him. He takes him out. He's not an Absalom fan, so why is he sending this lady to try to bring Absalom back? And I think the only answer, we can't give a firm answer because it's one of those the Bible doesn't tell us, but I think probably the answer is in the latter part of that chapter was Absalom's popularity. He's a good-looking man. He is a smooth talker, and so the people are kind of saying, look, why are you being so hard on Absalom? Why not bring him back? He's a smooth operator for sure, and you see that nowhere more clearly than in chapter 15. So again, I don't know if we can say 100% for sure, but that seems probably the likely thing is that Joab is feeling some pressure from the people. Bring Absalom home, and so he comes up with this plot, and he knows if he goes to David and says, hey, here's what the people want, here's what I think you should do, it's not going to go over. But he like Nathan, he comes in with this parable, this lady saying about her 2 sons, and David says, oh, nobody's going to hurt your son. And she says, well, now hang on here, king. So it was a I don't know if I'd say a smart move by Joab, a clever move. It's sly, subtle. I don't know. I'd have to look at that a little bit more. He asked why did they call her a wise woman, and I don't know that I have a answer just right off. I bet it's because she was wise. I don't know. But there might be something to that. That's an interesting thought. I need to. In fact, I'm gonna make a note. That was my smart aleck response, Robert. But I don't know. That's interesting. Where is that? Chapter 14. What verse was it? 2? I'm going to check that out, see if there's, it really, no, in all seriousness, it may just be as simple as that. She was just known as being a wise woman, but there may be something to that. I'll have to look and see. Getting into chapter 15, Absalom prepares these chariots and horses, 50 men to run before him. I had a note here. Oh, the chariots and horses and the men, this is a sign of prestige, honor, leadership. Absalom, he's beginning to plot against David. He doesn't really want to see his father. That's never what this was about. This was about Absalom trying to gain control of the kingdom and to rule. So Absalom rose up early. He gets up early every day. He stood beside the way of the gate, and it was so. You may recall from our Wednesday night class, the gate. There's always a lot going on in any city at the gate, right? There's judgment going on. There's gossip. People kind of gather as sort of a ancient water cooler type gathering place where people could talk about, hey, did you hear about so and so? Did you hear about Joseph and Mary? They're going to get married, and all this, and some of that's just innocent chatter, and some of that's gossip, and then there's judgment that goes on, official matters. A lot of business takes place in and around the city gate. So there's just a lot of activity. So my point with all that is to say, if you want to get in front of a lot of people in a culture where there's no internet, newspaper, television news channels, then the place to go is the city gate. And Absalom knew that. And so he gets up early, and he goes and stands in the gate. And so when anybody had a controversy, they came to the king for judgment. By the way, this seems to be one of the reasons why David ends up losing control of his kingdom for a time to Absalom. There don't appear to be any judges at the gate. So for whatever reason, it seems that David is neglecting some of the matters of state that he should be looking after. And I don't know if it's because of all the problems in his family and he feels like he's constantly dealing with that. But Absalom was able to come and he talks to the people. What city are you from? They'd say, I'm from one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom would say, see, thy matters are good and right, there in verse 3, but there's no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Well, there's no judge. It doesn't seem that he's just making this up. If he was, it wouldn't hold any weight. It wouldn't carry any weight if he's just saying, well, there's no judge to hear your case. If there is a judge, they'd say, well, of course there is. He's right here. So it does seem that there was no judge. Why? Why does David not have a judge? This kind of goes back to Exodus 18, by the way. Remember Jethro, Moses' father-in-law? He came to Moses and he says, you're hearing all these cases, Moses, and you're going to burn out. You need to get judges and, sub-judges, if you will, and the different levels of government, we might say. And so, you need to have people in charge of 50, people in charge of 100, people in charge of 1,000, and so on and so forth. So, but for whatever reason, it doesn't seem there are any judges. So there's nobody deputed of the king to hear thee. And so Absalom would go on and say, oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come to me, and I would do him justice. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. So again, he's good looking, smooth talker, kisses all the babies. He's just a perfect politician, and we might say more particularly a perfect superficial politician. There's nothing sincere about him. Some people get into politics because they want to serve their country, they want to serve their community, they want to help, and some people get in it because they want power, because they want something for themselves. Absalom is in it for himself. So, on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Underline that little phrase, because he did, in fact, steal the hearts of the men of Israel. Before we close out, that was our first bell, right? Okay. Before we close out, I want to mention in verse 7, it says, it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said unto the king, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow, which I vowed unto the Lord in Hebron. Of course, Absalom doesn't think David knows what's going on, and it appears, at least in large part, David doesn't know what's going on. But I want to, before we close out this particular class, verse 7, 40 years? How long did David reign? 40 years. Well, Absalom's already been at Hebron Geshur, for how long? 3. David's still reigning. It cannot be. And so what just wanted to point out with this, it has to be a copyist error. And sometimes in Hebrew, I've never studied Hebrew as far as an actual language study, but it is very, very easy to confuse some of the letters, and sometimes the difference in 40 and 400 or 40 and 4 is just a tiny little mark. And so you can see where a copyist error might happen. The Septuagint and most Hebrew manuscripts actually have 40 here, but again, it could be a copyist error. Josephus, the Jewish historian, the Syriac version, they have 4 years. It came to pass after 4 years. We know he was at Geshur for 3 years. We saw that in 2 Samuel 13. This could be about a year after his return, but that timeline doesn't work because I just remembered, I missed this earlier when I was looking at it. Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, verse 28 of chapter 14. So in chapter 13, we know he was at Geshur 3 years, but 2 years at Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. So that's 5. Probably, I think, and I was thinking this anyways before I caught that, and I need to make a note of that so I can correct my notes. But there are actually 2 Hebrew manuscripts. There are not a lot of Hebrew manuscripts available. The New Testament is just, the manuscript evidence is just astounding. Not nearly as many Hebrew manuscripts. Why is that, by the way? Does anybody remember this from our How We Got the Bible study? I know that's been like 6 years ago, but part of it was the material. Yeah, it just wasn't as long-lasting. But also it was the respect the Jews had for the law. When it became old and in their minds was getting, even sometimes we have an old Bible, and I don't know if any of you have an old Bible that maybe you've had for 20 years or 30 years or more, and it's falling apart at the seams, literally sometimes. They wouldn't do that. When that Bible started getting the equivalent, now understand they didn't use paper that the same as us, but when it started getting even like a frayed page or a torn page, they retired it. They had, we have special procedures for how to dispose of a U.S. flag with respect and all that. Well, they had their own procedures. They weren't inspired by God, but they were just out of respect. They would destroy that copy and replace it with a new, pristine copy. And so you don't have all these manuscript evidence. But there are 2 Hebrew manuscripts that have 40 days, or 40 days, not years, yom in the Hebrew. So to me, that's probably the most logical explanation, and that's the timeline that makes the most sense here, 40 days. So after 40 days of this coming to the gate early in the morning and all day, every day with the people, if there was just somebody here to hear your case, man, if I was the judge, you got a point. You deserve justice, but there's nobody here to give it to you. You could see that would be, for that to go on 4 years unnoticed would be difficult. For that to go on 40 years unnoticed would that doesn't even fit because of David's reign. It was only 40 years. So 40 days of that makes sense. And so he steals the hearts of the people away, and now he's got, this opportunity to carry out his rebellion. And so that's what he's going to do. What was that verse I mentioned in 14? I need to add that. So that makes the most sense to me when you're studying this. Why Hebron? Why does Absalom go to Hebron? I don't know that anybody can give a definitive answer. We do know from 1 Chronicles 3, verses 1 and 2, that Absalom was one of the sons born to David where? In Hebron. This is his birthplace, so he's probably got a lot of friends there, right? It may also be that perhaps the people, the inhabitants, the citizens of Hebron are a little unhappy with David for moving the capital to Jerusalem. I don't know. That's just a possibility. But anyway, when you go on, Absalom tells David he's made a vow. I want to go pay my vow in Hebron because I promised God if you'd return me to Jerusalem, I will serve the Lord. He's lying through his teeth, as we say. This is all about his conspiracy. And so the king says, go in peace, and he goes to Hebron. And of course, Absalom sends spies throughout all the tribes of Israel. There's a lot more to this than what this little phrase reveals. Obviously, this is a very elaborate plan that Absalom has, and he's going to carry out this plan with precision, and he's going to attempt at least a coup to take over the throne. So that's a good stopping point in chapter 15. We'll pick up there and see some more of